All right, so we're going to talk about some of the biological molecules. Some of the main molecules that find their way into biology. We've already talked about things like oxygen and carbon dioxide and water and the role that they play. Those are very small, tiny molecules made of only a few atoms. When we talk about biological molecules, they get very big. They become very large. And of course, we also talked a little bit about vitamins and minerals. So we've covered that much in our previous lesson. So now what we're going to talk about are the bigger molecules, there's three main groups. Okay? And the first group that we'll talk about are called the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. You can tell by their name what's in them. If you think about carbohydrate, the carbo part makes you think of carbon, and hydrate makes you think of water, right? And water is made of two things, H's and O's. And so if you put all these together, carbohydrates are molecules that are just made up of only three different types of atoms, just carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. But remember, when we were talking the other day, these carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, they can hold hands in many different ways. They can form covalent bonds by sharing their electrons. But the number of patterns they can make are phenomenally large, because carbon can basically form 4 different bonds. Carbon can also do some other interesting things that you'll learn about later in chemistry, where it can shuffle up its electrons and it can form 3 bonds or 2 bonds or 1 bond. It's very versatile. And that's why carbon is sort of the basic atom that all living things are built around. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the only 3 atoms that we need to make these carbohydrates. So what might one look like, just for an example? Well, the most common carbohydrate is a molecule that's very complicated. So we'll draw a picture of it here. I wouldn't expect you to memorize this just yet, but next year you will. Your teachers might want you to memorize this. Let's take a carbon atom and draw it here. And we have to hold hands with another carbon atom up here. Now, we sometimes draw the lines a little bit longer with these big molecules because it's hard to fit them all together. They're so complicated. So sometimes the lines are long and sometimes they're short, but it still just means that that's sharing a covalent bond, right? It's sharing electrons. And so another carbon can share over here. And then another carbon can share over here. Now over here we have something interesting. I'll change the colors up here. I'll put a red one in here. Over here we have an oxygen that's holding hands. Oxygen only holds hands twice, right? So we'll put the oxygen there, and then we'll go down here and we get a carbon. And you notice this makes sort of like a nice hexagon shape, right? And it's looped around in a ring. Remember we talked yesterday about how you can take these carbons, right, that are all twisted like this, but if they twist around, you can put them into a ring. Now remember, in order to get them into a ring, you have to add energy to them, right? You have to add energy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the process that plants use to add energy to make this particular molecule in this shape. But we're not done yet. There's more to add. So now we'll go up here. From here, and we'll make another C, like this. So those are all the carbons. There are 6 of them, right? So, okay, battery problem is fixed. So there are 6 of the carbons there. So underneath, we'll write here, maybe I'll write it in bigger letters here, C6. Which means 6 carbon atoms going together. Okay, now we also have an O, but I'm going to wait because there's more O's to come. All right, so now in green, I'm going to go and add some other things here. Remember, carbon has to hold hands 4 times. It has to form 4 covalent bonds. So up here, there's a bond with a hydrogen. There's another bond with a hydrogen. That's 3 bonds. And then, of course, we need 1 more. And so here what happens is it's a bond with an oxygen, and then a bond with another hydrogen. And in biology, we often don't show the little stick between O's and H's. It's there, but it's so common, we just write it together like that. OH. Hydroxide. Remember hydroxide? And they often stick together, so they're kind of written as a shorthand, right? There's a lot of shortcuts in drawing these big molecules because they're so complicated. Now, if we go down below that, there's still a carbon there that is missing one bond. See this one? There needs to be another bond here to make 4, and there's a hydrogen attached to that, H. And over on this one, if we go to the left, there has to be 2 more bonds, and there's a hydrogen attached to that one, but there's another one of these O's attached here, and it has a little H on it. This is a pain, but the color coding is jumping around. There, like that. And then we see this next one. Well, guess what? There's going to be another, maybe if I do all the O's first, there's going to be an O there. Oh, that's kind of dark. Let's do it nice here. So I don't keep having to bounce around. I'll do all the red O's. There's going to be an O attached here. There's going to be another O attached over here. And there's going to be one more attached over here. So those are the 3 O's. And then we can go to the green and put in the rest of the H's. There's an H attached here, because remember, oxygen has to hold hands twice, right? It has to form 2 covalent bonds. So one is with the carbon, one is with the hydrogen. And then the 4th bond here is a hydrogen. The 4th one is here is a hydrogen. There's a hydrogen with this O, there's a hydrogen with that O, and there's a hydrogen here. And that's what this molecule looks like. What's really interesting, what people forget, is that these molecules form these particular shapes and things relatively easily. You put all the atoms in a cup and you shake them up, right? And they bounce around and they form pairs of joining. It's kind of random. There's no real rule that says you have to join in a certain way. As long as you can find a way to join with someone and share your electrons, you become more stable. But of course, what happens is some arrangements are more stable than others. This arrangement has stability. It can hang around like this for a long time, but it can also be broken down into smaller things and become even more stable. And we'll talk about that later. So then we can count up the H's, and if you count them, you should find that there are 12 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we write H12. And then if you count the red O's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, there are different ways that this molecule can sort of take on its shape. Remember that all the bonds are twisty. So when you look on the left or the right side, those bonds can twist so that the little hydroxides, see these little OHs here? This whole bond can twist upside down, so the OH goes on the top and the H goes on the bottom. And the same thing can happen pretty much at every carbon all over the place. So all the different twisty possibilities are all given different names in biology, right? And they're called isomers. They're called molecules that look the same. They have the same number of atoms, but they don't look quite the same. They twist and turn. We're not going to get into all that. We're just going to learn that this is just an example of a carbohydrate molecule. And it's C6H12O6. The common name for this, at least its most popular form, is glucose. But glucose has lots of possible different shapes it can take. So if it twists a different way and the little hydroxides go on the top instead of the bottom, we have different names for it. So there's glucose, there's galactose, there's something like, we can sometimes call it dextrose, and there's L-glucose, and there's D-glucose, and there's all kinds of different names in biology to describe all the different ways this molecule can twist and turn. That's how complicated organic chemistry is. But for us, we don't want to get into that. We just want to learn that glucose, you should remember this. This is sort of the simple form. It doesn't show us what it looks like, but at least it tells us what atoms are in it. And you can see it's got C's and H's and O's. So it is a carbohydrate molecule. And it's the most common. And this is the one that when you eat starches and sugars, your body breaks everything down into this, or one of its very closely related forms. And it uses this molecule and breaks it apart to produce energy. we had said before that something had to put energy into the glucose to build it into this shape. It's like Legos, right? It takes energy to build it. And we said that plants use sunlight, and they can actually build glucose molecules through photosynthesis. Now we use them, and all the other animals, and plants do too. They also break it down, and they use it to make the energy, or to release the energy that's been sort of stored up in there. If you look at all those bonds, see all these bonds represent energy. And so if you break bonds apart and you break these open, you can release the energy that was used to make the bond or put in. Okay, so glucose. So that's an example of what we call a sugar. A sugar. So carbohydrates are simply called sugars in everyday language. Now, the other thing you can do with glucose is you can stick them together. I'm not going to get into all the pictures of that because that's too complicated. But you remember how this was like a hexagon shape right here? See this picture? So if we just imagine that being representing a glucose like this, there's one glucose molecule. They can actually stick together through chemical reactions and make long chains of sugar molecules all stuck together. Right? And this is called a starch. So that's another form of carbohydrate in our diet, sugar and starch. Starch is a long chain of sugars stuck together. And these are the two major carbohydrates. So basically, we want to remember that when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're talking about sugars. Whoops. My smartboard is being silly. We're talking about sugars and starches in our diet. What foods have a lot of sugars and starches? Well, mostly plants, because plants use photosynthesis to make glucose. So they store it up inside them, and the glucose is stored as sugars. If you're reading labels of foods and you see anything that ends in O's, fructose, sucrose, the sugar you put on your table is called sucrose. It's actually made of two sugars stuck together. So it gets complicated. There's lots of different kinds. We don't have to worry. We just have to know that if something ends with O's, it's probably a sugar, or at least it has a sugar in it. So that's the chemical ending that makes us think about sugars and starches. Okay? Now starches have different names. The most common starches, so sugars end in O's, right? Those are all the different sugar molecules, and some of them are one ring, some of them are two, and there's all kinds of different ones. But the other thing is the starches, they have different names, and I'm going to just give you a couple of names so you can remember. Okay? Starches are things that the commonest ones are glycogen. You can see how it has the glucose sort of name in it because it's made up of glucoses all stuck together. So they call it glycogen. This is how humans, we have this in our body, and it's a kind of starch. We use it to sort of temporarily store up sugar, glycogen. Okay. Another important starch is cellulose. Cellulose is the thing that we call fiber when we eat food. And we know it has fiber, right? Bran, lettuce, and vegetables, and things like that. Cellulose, as we're going to see, is a very important component of what's called the cell wall in plants. So it's kind of an important one. Okay? All right. Okay, there is one more, I guess, that we can talk about. It's called amylose. And this is the kind of starch that a lot of plants make inside them. Plants make this. Okay? We'll get to that later. The beautiful thing is that all these biological molecules can be turned from one into the other by complicated chemical reactions that living things can do, as long as there's a source of energy. Remember, it takes energy to change the shape of molecules. And so if we have energy, we can bump molecules together and get them to change their shape and do different things and turn one into the other, and all the chemical reactions of life can begin. So there's our carbohydrates, all right? There's our carbohydrates. They are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. A very important one is glucose, which is a kind of sugar. We have a picture of it there. If you stick sugars together, you can make starches. And some of the most important sugars and starches are listed here. The important sugars, I just said they end with O's. I didn't really give you examples, but I could give you a couple of important ones. Glucose is kind of important. Whoops, glucose, right? And another one, fructose is another one that is made fruit. Fruit makes this sugar. It's what makes fruit taste very sweet and delicious. Fructose, those are two examples, but there are many. There's too many for us to get into. But all we have to do is remember that if they end with this O's, then they're probably a sugar of some sort. And these are the carbohydrates. The primary purpose of carbohydrates, well, there is a couple different purposes. So the uses, here's what carbohydrates are used for by biological things like animals and plants. They are used to build structures. We're going to be learning about cells very soon, and inside the cell there are all kinds of little structures, little machines that do things. And starches and sugars are sometimes used to build them. Okay? Like, for instance, the cell wall of the plant is made of cellulose. But more importantly, this one I'm going to put a star, because this is sort of like the main thing. They are used as I'm going to put primary energy source. Okay, let me erase that and write a P here. Primary energy source. The truth is that living things are very ingenious. They're very versatile. They can draw energy from lots of different molecules. But if carbohydrates are around, they prefer those because they're the easiest to sort of break down and make happen, right? They're the easiest to sort of get going. So they prefer those. Okay, so primary energy source. And we know this because we eat sugars to get some energy, right? To get our pep when we're ready to go. Where do we find starches and sugars in our food? Where do we find them? Where are they found? Well, they're found in vegetables and fruit. Fruit is very sugary. Vegetables don't taste so sweet because they're more starchy. Starches don't taste as sweet. Usually it's the sugars that taste sweet, but the starches are different. So vegetables and fruit have a lot of this in them. And not so much meats, but there is starches and sugars in meat, but not as much. Right? So when we write stuff like this, we remember we're talking about the main sources, right? There are animals that eat only meat, and they get enough sugar and starch from their diet of eating only meat. But for humans, vegetables and fruits are probably grains too. Grains, somewhat. All right? So that's where we find these, and they're important for us. Okay. You know what, though? They also are found in meats as well. So maybe I'll put meats down here, too. Maybe in brackets, because meats are primarily protein, right? We know that. They're not the major source of carbohydrate, but there's enough carbohydrate in meat. There's a lot. In fact, glycogen, which is the starch that animals make, is found in meat, lots of it. So it's there. But we just traditionally think of meats as being a protein source rather than a carbohydrate source, carbs, right? Fruits, vegetables, and grains, and anything that's made with them. So guess what's made with grains, right? Grains becomes breads, cereals, pastas, rice, which is a very common one, corn. It's interesting how rice and corn and wheat, if you think about that, those three little plants have been used to make so many different things. We've learned to make flour out of them by grinding them up. And we can make, like, for instance, when you have tacos, those hard taco shells, well, they're made with corn. They're made with flour that's been made by grinding up corn. Whereas a loaf of bread might be made with flour that's made by grinding up wheat. Or you could grind up rice and make rice flour. Some of the noodles, like some of the, maybe not ramen, but some of the different oriental noodles that are kind of whitish, those are made from rice. They're rice noodles. So we've used all these different or we've gained all these different things from these three different grains: rice, breads, cereals, pastas, corn, and so on. Right? And of course, there are also other sources of sugar that we have to be careful about. We also have to watch things like candy. Why is candy bad? Well, candy has a lot of sugar. And you think, well, sugar's good, it's energy. But the problem is it has a lot of it. So you eat a little piece of candy and you get a lot of energy at once. It's harder for your body to handle, and so your body starts to store the energy rather than use it. And of course, that means you're making a new molecule called fats, which changes the way your body looks and feels, because the more fat you have, your health can be at risk. And then, of course, candy has nothing else in it. Don't forget, when you eat a fruit, it also has vitamins, it has minerals, it has other things that are good for you. Whereas candy is just empty sugar. There's not much else in it except sugar. So it's not the best food source. It's not the best way to get your carbs, right? Pop is another one. Pop has a lot of sugar, tons of it, but nothing else that's really good for you. So they're not balanced foods, candy and pop, and so on. And a lot of processed foods, by processed, what we mean are things that are ready-made. So, you go and eat your pizza pockets, you pop them in the microwave, and it looks like there's lots of good food in there. And there is some good stuff in there that you can use, but there's a lot of sugar and starches. Sugars are added to make things taste good. So if something is sort of low-quality food, and you want it to taste good, you add lots of sugar. And people will eat it, even though it's low-quality food. So you have to watch. Processed foods, candies and pops, these are sort of what we'll call empty carbs, because they do contain a lot of carbohydrate, but they don't have much of anything else. So that makes them not very balanced foods for us to be relying on. They're fine once in a while, but you don't want to eat them every day. Okay, so that's the carbohydrates and sugars and starches. Next, we'll talk about the next group of molecules called fats and lipids. Now, these molecules are very big. They're even bigger than the carbohydrates. They're huge, in fact. And fats and lipids primarily are storage molecules. So what you do is if you have a lot of sugars and you can't use them all up right away, then what you do is you get your sugars and you convert them into fats. So you change the shape of the molecule into a very large molecule. You build them all up. It would be kind of like if you had a whole bunch of Legos and they were all over the floor and you wanted to sort of store them up, but you didn't have a container. So what you could do is you could stick them all together into very large blocks of different Legos, right? And that would make them neater. And then you could always go and break them apart later when you needed them, right? So it's kind of like that. So if we think about fats and lipids, they are still made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they're like carbohydrates, but they're converted into these bigger molecules we call fats and lipids. I'll give you an example of some molecules. Not that we're going to memorize them, but just so you can see how big they are. Okay? So here's a molecule. It's usually a chain of carbons like this, and it goes on and on and on. They're all stuck together. I'm going to draw that many, but you could have like 28 of them, 30 of them, 40 of them all in a row. And there's so many different variations, right? We give each one its own name. If it has 1 carbon or 2 or 5 or 10, they all have different names. And so it's very complicated. Now, the chain, obviously those carbons still have to hold hands 4 times. So what happens is they have hydrogens all attached all around like this, hydrogen atoms holding on to make sure that every carbon is holding hands 4 times, 4 covalent bonds. Okay? Like this. And then at the end of the molecule, there's a very interesting thing that happens. There are a couple of O's attached. One is attached here by a double bond. It's holding twice, like that. So that's a double share. And then there's another O attached here. And of course, then he needs one more hand as well. And then there's an H, like that. And this molecule is called a fatty acid, just in case you're interested. It's called a fatty acid. It's actually called a carboxylic acid, but it's going to become, from where we're going, it's going to be called a fatty acid. This little piece at the end, this little piece here, is what makes it an acid. Because see this little hydrogen right here? He can pop off if you put this in water. And he can ride along on a water molecule and make this guy. And remember, hydronium is what makes acids. So that can happen, but we don't really have to worry about that right now, so I'll erase that. Okay? Now, this is not the whole fat. This is just a piece of it. So what happens now is you get another molecule, okay? And I told you this is going to get big, but we're just doing this to sort of get a visual in our heads of how big these things can be. So now, I'm going to not do colors anymore because it's too much jumping around. So you take 3 carbons like this, and you stick O's on them like this, and then you stick H's all around the back like this. And this is a molecule called glycerol. We don't have to worry about that yet. But then what happens is these O's can attach. See this end right here? Well, if you flip that around, this H can pop off, right? And what we get then is this O attaching here. Actually, the O and the H can pop off completely. And then you get this. So this is like the backwards version of what we wrote above, stuck onto this molecule. And then all around here, these are all H's. So look at how many atoms there are inside this molecule. Oops, there's an H, 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 H. And then what can happen is you can have one chain attached. This is called a monoglyceride. You can attach another chain right here and do the same thing again. I won't draw it, but you could have another chain of C's, maybe 30 or 40 of them with H's all around. That's a diglyceride. And then one more. You can get up to 3 because there's 3 sort of joining spots here where the O's are. That's a triglyceride. Some of you might have heard of triglycerides because in humans, that's one of the things we like to monitor and watch in our bloodstream. If we get too many triglycerides, we have too much fat, it can affect our health, right? So triglycerides are something that we monitor because triglycerides are very common in the fats of humans. So you get the mono, or the di, or the triglyceride. You can see how the names work, right? Glyceride. It's got this glycerol. Remember I told you that was called glycerol. And you attach the fatty acids to it to make a glyceride. And if you attach 1, it's mono. If you attach 2, it's di, and so on. But these are big molecules, which means they have lots of bonds, which means they store a tremendous amount of energy. Store lots of energy in their bonds. And that's their primary purpose, okay? Maybe you want to write that down as the purpose. Like, I'm not following the same format. Over here, see how he wrote their uses? Well, fats, maybe we should do that just so it looks the same for you. If we talk about the uses of fats, they are also used to build structures. Things are made of fat. In fact, cell membranes are made mostly of fat. They build structures, or lipids. Generally, when we talk about them as individual molecules, we call them lipids. But when they get together and they form sort of large conglomerations, we start to call them fat or fats. So, but it's for now we can just call them this. We can use the words interchangeably, fat or lipid, right? They build structures, but of course, their big one is they store energy. Store energy. All right, store energy. Where do we find fats? Well, they're found in anything that contains fat. So if you think about that, what do we do? Butter, lard that we use to bake with, oils of all kinds, vegetable oil, olive oil, anything that's a kind of oil, those are all essentially very, very high fats. In fact, they're pretty much all fat. There's hardly anything else in them. There's a few little minerals and vitamins and things, but mostly they're fat. We don't usually eat these things alone. We tend to use them either to cook stuff with. We fry things in oil, or we spread them on our bread like butter. But they're added to foods, right? And they're good because they make food taste all nice and greasy, a little bit slimy. Like bread is dry, but you put butter on it, and now it's all nice and buttery, right? So we tend to eat a lot of fats as additions to our food to make it taste better. But there are also foods that contain lots of fat, right? You can also find fat in meat products. Now, some meat is very lean, so it has a little bit of fat, but some meat is fattier. If you look at a piece of steak, right, a nice T-bone steak here, there's the bone in the middle. Well, you have all this nice meat, but you might notice that there are tiny little sort of strips of white. I can't draw in white. I can't do that, but I'll draw it in black, but you know what I mean. You'll see little streaks through the meat. Well, those are streaks of fat. The more streaks there are, the fattier the meat is. So when you're buying meats to eat or choosing meat to eat, you got to be careful. If you're trying to cut down on fat, you got to buy leaner meat with less fat streaked through it. But then if you think about a piece of bacon, well, there's a strip of bacon. It's got sort of a little blob of meat here and a little blob of meat down here and maybe some over here, and it's got all this white stuff in there. That's a lot of fat. So bacon is a much fattier meat. So which one would you choose if you were trying to cut down on how much fat you ate, right? You'd choose the steak instead of the bacon. So meat products can contain lots of fats, if depending on what kind of cut and where it comes from, right? So that's another place where we find them. And surprisingly, vegetables. Vegetables. And how do we know this? Well, you say, oh, aren't vegetables good for you? Well, they are, but most of the oils we use come from vegetables. If you squeeze them, oil comes out. You can get mazola, corn oil, by squeezing corn. You can squeeze certain vegetables, right? You can squeeze olives, squeeze them, and oil comes out. They're full of oil. Now, some vegetables have more oil than others. So you never see broccoli oil because there's not a whole lot of oil in broccoli. You'd have to squeeze 10,000 pounds to get a drop. But some vegetables have lots of oils, so we use them. We squeeze them and we get their oils out and we use them. So things like olives, corn is a common one. Or the other thing where we find them is seeds and nuts. And so things like canola oil made by canola seeds. If you ever take a sunflower seed and you put two pieces of paper towel around it and squeeze it, just squeeze it with your fingers, and then look at the paper towel, it's all greasy because there's lots of oil in the seeds. So seeds and nuts are very high sources of where we find oils and fats. Now, there's two kinds of fats we're going to just talk about because we do want to talk about how these things affect us and, thinking about our health. And so there are what we call saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Now, here's what's cool about saturated and unsaturated, what that means. Well, the word saturated is a big word that means to be full of, to hold as much as you can. So I'm just going to draw a picture. I'm going to show you those little fatty acid chains. So what I'm talking about are these guys up here. Remember these that are stuck to the fat? If you look at the chain, you can look at the carbons, and there's a couple things that can happen. If it's a saturated fat, I'm just going to put the ... here to show the rest of the molecule. A saturated fat means that all the carbons are holding hands once. All one single bond. And all around the outside, there are hydrogens. I'm not going to draw the hydrogens because it's too much trouble, but there's H. Well, maybe I should. Let's put them in fast. H's all around here. Okay? That's a saturated fat, and it's special because all of the carbons have single bonds. But remember, carbon can hold hands more than once, and there's no rule that says it can't hold hands with itself twice. It can form two shared bonds easily. So an unsaturated fat has fats that look like, or chains that look like this. Every once in a while, there's a double bond. Now, what a double bond does is in order to hold hands twice, the atom has to sort of shift its position. And so the double bond makes the molecule have a kink in it, or a bend. It changes the shape. And now if you put the hydrogens around, be careful, because you got to count. Because what happens is, over here, see this carbon, he only needs one hydrogen to make 4 bonds, because he's holding twice with the carbon next to him. And this guy only needs 1, because he's holding 4 times already. So that means there's less hydrogen in this guy. That's why he's unsaturated. He doesn't have the full maximum amount of hydrogen. He's got less hydrogen. That's one of the things that they have. What's important, though, is the effect that has. It changes the shape of the molecule. It changes the shape. And you're going to learn in biology that the shape of molecules is very important to how they act and what they do. So if you change the shape of a molecule, you'll change the way it behaves and functions in your body. And it might not be something that you want, right? Or it might be something preferable. So the other thing, though, that happens is you can also get, and just to show you, you can also get a triple bond. So here's my carbons. Here's 3 holding hands. That's possible. And of course, whoops, let me just draw that with a bend in it, because that would also make the molecule bend and kink and twist in a weird way. So to hold hands 3 times, that would be even less hydrogens, because if you put them around like this, well, that one's already got 4 hands, doesn't it? 3 to the other carbon and 1 to the one behind it. So you don't need any hydrogens on those 2 guys. So that's even less hydrogen. Right? Even less if you have a triple bond, even less hydrogen, and also changes shape. So there's 2 kinds of unsaturated fats. There's double bond ones, and sometimes they can have 3 or 4 double bonds, many different double bonds, which means they're all bent and kinky and switch and all out of shape. So what's the difference? Well, the main difference is that when we look at human health, it seems, right? It seems that the unsaturated fats with their kinky shapes and bends and twists are healthier for us, or at least are not as problematic as these are the sort of, I don't want to say healthy, but I'm going to say not as problematic. All fats are healthy. One of the things we do that's wrong in the world with our world of nutrition and diet is we try to label everything as good or bad. This is good for you, that's bad for you. That's not really a good approach. All things are somewhat good for you, and all things can be bad for you. What really matters, of course, is the amounts that you eat and take in, right? And that's what the whole idea of a balanced diet means, is having a little bit of everything. So not as problematic, right? Whereas the saturated fats tend to more easily cause issues or problems with humans. So that's the difference that we should learn. We should learn that there are 2 kinds, saturated and unsaturated, and it has to do with the double bonds, whether they're there or not, right? So, saturated has all single bonds and unsaturated has double or triple. But the key thing is it changes the shape and it makes the molecules act different. And it seems that for humans, we tend to eat more saturated fat than we need. And so typical advice from a nutritionist is to try to shift your diet to include more unsaturated fats, which you find in vegetables and oils, rather than eating so much fat from that are saturated, which are more found in animal products. But that doesn't mean that saturated fats are all bad. It just means that our particular diet here in the Western world tends to have a shift where it's focused too much on the saturated fats and not enough on the unsaturated. So we don't need to eliminate all animal products from our diet. That's going too far. All we need to do is shift a little bit. So we're not just relying on steak every night, right? And of course, you can tell the difference very easily. Saturated fats, if you just keep the chart going, saturated fats tend to be solid. So butter, lard, right? And the fats in meat like we call it gristle and fat, animal fats. Animal fats. They tend to be sort of solid. They're not hard. Whoops, what happened to my screen here? There we go. They're not super hard. There's gooey and like soft, but they're still solid. They still form, like a butter forms a block, whereas you can't make a block of olive oil. So liquidy ones, liquid, like oils, those tend to be unsaturated. And so if you're trying to reduce the amount of saturated fat that you eat, you would shift towards eating more liquidy oils instead of solid, chunky fats. You would cook with vegetable oil or olive oil instead of cooking with butter, right? That would be a good way to change the way your diet goes. But again, don't fall into the trap of thinking that there's good and bad. It's all about balance. That's the real key to nutrition. And so you need a little bit of both. Okay, so there we have the fats. There's one more group we have to talk about, and then we can wrap up this video. And this group, of course, is the last one in our list. It's called the proteins. Okay, proteins. And proteins are probably the most versatile molecules of the biological world. They do everything. They are messengers. They build structures. They function in your body like hormones. They control and regulate other chemical reactions. In fact, many proteins are catalysts that make other reactions happen. Remember we talked about the rates of reactions and we said that if you have a catalyst present, it'll go faster? Remember that? Well, these proteins are biological catalysts that we call enzymes, and they do a million different things. They're the workhorses of biology. Now, in order to do all those jobs, they have to be extremely complicated. Extremely complicated. So complicated that it's easier for me just to show you a picture of one than try to draw one. Okay, so here's an internet picture of a kind of insulin. Insulin is a protein molecule that we use in our bodies, and you know that insulin it helps to make sure you have the right amount of sugar in your blood, right? And if you don't have insulin, you can have diabetes, and you have to inject it into your body. It's a very important protein. What I want you to see here, it's a little blurry because it's hard to find a picture on the internet of just the atoms. But you see all these little black lines and boxes. Well, every corner, every little point or intersection that you see is a carbon atom, right? So if I can draw, there's a carbon atom right there. There's another one here and here and here. All the little here, all these dots that I'm drawing are just carbons. Okay? And if you went around all the way, there must be 75 carbon atoms or more. Maybe there's 100 in there. I don't know. There's a lot of them. It's huge. And then some of the other colors, like the blues and the reds, are showing some other parts of the molecule where there might be an O, an oxygen, but there's also another atom in these molecules that is not in the fats and carbohydrates. That's nitrogen. Nitrogen shows up in proteins. It's a good multiple choice question, which of the following contains nitrogen? Fats, lipids, sugars, or proteins? And you'd have to know. The nitrogen is the sort of extra atom that makes these things so cool. They also contain a little bit of sulfur sometimes. So proteins contain more atoms than just CH and O, but not a whole lot. Still just about 4 or 5 atoms. So far, we've made all the major molecules of life with only about 5 or 6 different atoms, which is pretty cool if you think about it. But look at how complicated it is. Now, what these are, each of these little groups here, you can cut this up into pieces. And each of these little pieces has a special name. They're called amino acids. You probably have heard of that. They're little tiny molecules. They're kind of like little pieces of protein. And so the protein is made by, first you have to have these little amino acids, and there's about 20 different kinds of amino acids. And they're about the same size as glucose, maybe a little bit bigger. They have C's and N's and S's and O's and H's, and most of them have a little ring of some kind. You can see the rings. See all these little ring structures, right? There's lots of these ring structures in amino acids, loops of carbons and nitrogens and things. And then the amino acids are all stuck together in a chain like this. So when you put them all together in a chain, you get a strand, a big long string. But that's not the end of the story. Imagine if you take a big long string, okay, and you twist it all up into a ball like this, a big knot of string. There. That's what usually happens because of the big long string. The sulfurs and the nitrogens, and they push and they pull on each other, and they twist the big long string into a ball. Now, we're not done yet. Let me go back and get a different color. We're not done yet. Two strings might tangle together, and you might get another string tangled in like this over here. And sometimes maybe a third or fourth string. So imagine a ball of yarn. Actually, imagine three bundles of yarn, all twisted together like this. This is what a protein molecule looks like. If you could get on your magic school bus and shrink down and see a protein molecule, it would pretty much look like a giant ball of string. Now, if we zoom out, so we're not looking at all the individual atoms, we can see sort of, here's another picture that I have for you, this one. Right here, this picture sort of shows the same thing. This is human insulin, and it's showing you little black boxes, right? It's showing you where there are sulfurs. The little yellow guys, those are sulfur atoms, and see how they're sort of causing the twists, and they cause it to sort of bind up on itself and sort of glue little pieces together. And then there's all kinds of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens and nitrogens and making these amino acids. And then if I just go back to, if I just Google protein structure, that should be good enough, and we do some images, you can see sort of the whole ball of string effect. So here's a good picture, right? There's a green strand of yarn right here. And there's a blue strand of yarn, and they're all sort of twisted and tangled together, right? Into something like this. Here's a picture, one more picture, just to show you. It's always good to have, let's look at that hemoglobin, which is a very important protein in humans. I keep spelling structure wrong, but that's okay. It gets us there. Here it is. Let's see, any one of these pictures will do. Maybe this one is sort of the easiest to see. Nope, that's the wrong one. Maybe this one. Come back. Oh. You can see that there are tangled strings. There's 4 different protein strings all tangled together in a knot. And right in the middle of those knots, see, there's iron atoms, which is why we need iron in our blood. But see some of these pictures, they're like, this one's a good one, just to give you, I don't know why my computer is acting up. It's not giving me, there we go. See this one? If I click it, will it go bigger? Let's see. There it is. So you can see there's a yellow strand of protein, a chain, there's a red chain, and then there's even that weird little green structure. We won't get into that just yet, but you can see how complicated it is. It's like a giant ball of string all wrapped up. But that's really cool because a ball of string is flexible. It can be easily changed. Like here's a ball of string. You can change its shape. You can bend it and twist it. You can make a hole through the middle of the string and peek through, right? And so proteins, because they're so complicated and they can be bent and twisted in so many different ways, they can do a million different things. So there's sort of our structure of proteins. We're not going to draw the picture, but you've seen it now. So you get how complicated they are. You'll learn about that structure in grade 11 even more so. You'll learn about what we call the primary, secondary, and tertiary structure and how it all works. So those are the proteins. Okay, so we're going to write down they're very large, huge molecules, very large and complex. Bundles of amino acid chains. Remember, each piece was an amino acid. That's why if you're a bodybuilder, you know that muscles are made of protein, and if you want to make muscles, you need to have amino acids so that you can build the long chains to make the proteins to make your muscles. What bodybuilders, though, fail to realize is that unless you're going to the extreme end of the sport, if you're just trying to build a little bulk and get in shape and do some exercise, you're going to get all the amino acids you need from your balanced diet. There's no reason for you to take all these very expensive powders and milkshakes and drinks. Oh yeah, I'm pumping myself full. It doesn't really help you if you're eating a balanced diet. Unless, of course, you're actually competing for Mr. Universe and you want to be one of those extreme bodybuilders. Well, that's an extreme and it's not healthy, right? It's not healthy to push your body to any kind of extreme. Your body likes to ride down the middle, nice and comfortable. So you want to be in good shape, but you don't want to be extreme. It's too hard on your body. Okay, so those are the proteins. Now, what do they do? Whoops, Mr. Smartboard is jumping around. Well, they function in many, many different ways. They control chemical reactions, biochemical reactions. There's a protein that goes with almost every step or stage of every biochemical reaction. So if there's 1 million biochemical reactions and each of those has 40 or 50 or 200 steps, there's a protein for every step. So there's literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of protein molecules of different shapes and sizes. They control biochemical reactions. When they do this, they are basically, the way they control it, they're a catalyst, right? And a biological catalyst is called an enzyme. So you know what a catalyst is. It's something that helps make a reaction happen more easily or speeds up the rate. And if you see the word enzyme, that just means a protein that's making a reaction happen, right? You may have heard of enzymes already. That's one of their very important. They also form structures, though. Just about every kind of molecule can form structures, as we'll see very soon when we get into this cell. Okay? They also form messenger molecules that can be used by biological organisms to send messages throughout their body. So things like hormones, right, which hormones control how your body functions, and they send messages from one place to another. Hormones are secreted from places in your brain or from certain organs like ovaries and testes, or even like uteruses, and they're secreted from glands, the pituitary gland, the adrenal gland, all in your body, and they all have all these amazing things that they do. So hormone messengers, and so on, very important roles. I'm just going to add on here, they do just about anything. And the reason they can do it, the reason they can be so versatile and do just about anything, is due to their complicated or complex shape. Because if you think about a ball of string, you can take a ball of string in your hand and push it and pull it and twist it. You can change it into a shape like this that has sort of something like that. Or you can twist it so that the ball of string has a hole in the middle. That's a very important shape for proteins, with a hole in the middle. It opens a doorway, right? So things could go through the hole. You can change the shape of a protein in so many ways. One of the things you can do is you can take a protein, and the protein can have sort of 2 little bumps in it. And those bumps are places where other molecules can get stuck. And if the 2 molecules come along and get stuck in here, then the protein sort of squeezes them together and they can join them. So proteins can be used to make things stick together. They can also be used to pull things apart. That's how they act as catalysts. Enzymes do that. So they're very important because biology is all about turning one molecule into another, right? Changing molecules from their forms, and it's all about their shapes. And that's what proteins can do. So they're very important. Where do we find them? Where are proteins found? Well, meat, we know, contains a lot of protein, but so do vegetables. There are different kinds of proteins. There's millions of different proteins. right? So one of the things that we can do with proteins is we can eat the ones that are in meat. Our bodies can then use other proteins to pull them apart, like breaking them into their little pieces of Lego, their little amino acids, break them all apart and rebuild them into new proteins that we want to use. Our body has proteins, like for instance, your hair is a protein. And it's secreted by a cell in your scalp that just keeps adding to it, and it makes it stick out further and further and grow longer. Well, in order to build that hair, you need amino acids, and so you got to eat a piece of a cow so your digestive system can break it apart and then use those little amino acids to rebuild a new protein like keratin to make your hair. It's a very interesting complexity and interaction. Meat, vegetables, just about any food will have some protein, right? But meat and vegetables is where we usually find, and fruits as well to some degree, not so much. When you talk about protein, though, the main source for humans to get lots of protein is probably meat. It has the most protein sort of per pound. It's incredibly dense. And by meat, that also includes fish and other things, so shellfish and lobster, any kind of meat or animal product. But you can also get proteins from vegetables. But there is something interesting. I want to add here that there are about 20 amino acids we need to build proteins in our bodies, humans. Different organisms have different requirements. Some don't need all 20. We need 20. Our body can make some out of raw materials. We can take other molecules, bust them apart, and make them. There are some, though, that we can only get by eating them. Okay? And they call them the essential amino acids. Here's the problem. There's a couple of them that are not found in plants at all. So if you eat only plants and you never eat animal products, you might become deficient in a couple very important amino acids, which means you won't be able to make certain proteins, and that could be a problem. And so you have to be careful. If you are a vegetarian, or actually a vegan is worse, because they don't even eat eggs, they don't drink milk, no animal products. If you adopt a vegan lifestyle, you have to work a little harder to make sure you're getting all the amino acids you need. And you might need to take a supplement, like a supplement pill with amino acids to make sure you get the ones that are missing. Because actually humans are not designed to eat only one kind of food. That's an extreme, right? Generally speaking, we should probably all eat more fruits and vegetables because we tend to eat not enough. But nobody should eat only fruits and vegetables. That's too extreme. Because then your body's like, well, wait a minute, I'm missing things. A balanced diet is the healthiest diet. And so you have to be careful because you need to get all 20 of these amino acids into you. And there are a few that are not found in plants. They're only found in animals. So you have to eat a few animals or animal products to get them, or you got to take a supplement. You got to take a pill, right? So you have to watch that in terms of health. Remember, health is about balance. It's not good and bad things. It's not avoid this and never eat that and only eat this. There's no such thing as a superfood, right? They talk about superfoods. They're packed with vitamins. Well, that's all just a hoax to get you to buy stuff. You got to watch, right? The world is economic. It's about making money. The true scientists will tell you that balance is the key to good nutrition. A little bit of everything. Okay, so there are the proteins. And there's one more important molecule I mentioned, but we're not going to discuss it a whole lot. And they're called nucleic acids. I'll just mention them. Nucleic acids are special molecules. They're found in the nucleus of the cell. Well, not always. They're sometimes found outside the nucleus too, but that's kind of how they got their name. The most common one that you will know is deoxyribonucleic acid. And of course, its short form is DNA. And that, of course, is the molecule that forms our genes and the instruction book for building humans. In grade 11, you will learn all about this, and in grade 12, even more. And it's very interesting how this little molecule can actually control. So remember we said proteins control reactions? Genes are the instructions for how to make proteins. So if you have the instructions to make proteins, then of course you can then decide which ones to make and how to control all the reactions that make you do everything you do. So we're not going to get into this because it's a little beyond where we are, but it is another important biological molecule just to be aware of. Okay? And that's the story of these biological molecules. So we'll stop there. Save.